I think we're going to get started if everybody's okay because we have a full panel, and as people come in, they can catch up. I'm Val Mormillion with the America's Wetland Foundation, and for the better part, I guess, of this decade, the foundation has been convening coastal, environmental, governmental, and finance leaders. We've been trying to build a portfolio of private sector approaches to restoration, and it hasn't been really easy. We've been trying to also build evidence that ecosystem values actually do have a value, when many in academia do not want to place a value on the ecosystems provided, not only here in the United States, but it's very difficult to get anyone to put a price on the value of the ecosystems. So ecosystem valuing was our first goal, and following that, we wanted to make sure that we could get people to do ecosystem work, and that some of that work would have to come from the private sector. I don't think that it is a secret for anyone that the state is going to be hard-pressed to raise the funds for implementing its Coastal Master Plan as it's been announced. And so where does the money come from? Our foundation, in looking at ways in which you could involve the private sector, began looking at science-based solutions which are contained in the master plan, and it's a credit to Louisiana for keeping strong in the face of challenges to that, but also based on the reality of climate change and attendant sea level rise, which has accelerated the predictions in most people's books as to the state of the challenge facing Louisiana. It is equally challenging to talk about climate change in a state that doesn't want to, and to base your programs on good science when science is even being challenged. And so we're running against populist trends to try to involve a greater energy, if you will, from the private sector to be involved in what is somewhat going against the grain of popular sentiment in the country today, at least as expressed by voters in some elections. So we've gathered a panel that has great expertise, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about what we're trying to do in programs with the America's Wetland Foundation to have private sector restoration occur more readily in Louisiana. We're going to start with some stories, both tactical and as part of the history of some of these panelists, to deal with attracting private sector dollars for coastal restoration. Today's panelists have these good stories to tell. And first, we'll hear from Chip Klein, a leader in Louisiana's ambitious front to tackle coastal restoration and erosion. He will discuss the state's view on attracting private capital and the ideas that have sort of bubbled up to get more private dollars into the master plan funding. Rick Johnson from Energy will talk about how a corporation keeps its focus on an external issue like restoration and on the long-term continuum. What goes on in a corporation's mind to have them do stuff for the long term, all the while responding to the public's needs or demands as a utility, as a public utility. And, you know, it's not a secret that Entergy has been in the news lately, and they've had a really difficult run to move on their business continuum. And at the same time, they continue with groups like us and many others on a continuum to deal with coastal restoration because it's in the best interest of their ratepayers and the public. Jim Blackburn put his years of planning for the challenges of today up against the necessity to attract and confirm private sector participation in the restoration of ecosystems. Foundation has borrowed generously from Jim over time, and his work and his ideas, and we've always asked his permission so we wouldn't fall into that plagiarism category, and he's always said yes. So let's hear what they have to say. First, the man of many talents and carrying many headaches, Chip Klein. He's the Deputy Director of Coastal Activities for the Office of the Governor. Chip's a native Louisianan. He graduated from LSU and he went to Washington, sort of like I did, right out of college, which when you don't know better, that's what you do. And he worked in the Senate staff and then came back home and worked as a Deputy Director in the Governor's Office of Coastal Affairs. And he continued in that position and eventually became the Executive Assistant Chairman of the State Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority Board in 2015. He currently serves under Governor Edwards as the Deputy Director of these coastal activities, GOCA, and he represents the state of Louisiana as a designee in the Restore Council, which is the federal group that is taking some of the penalty monies and distributing them across the Gulf Coast. And he serves, I'm sure this is fun, on the Louisiana Oyster Task Force and the Atchafalaya Research and Promotion Board. All of these things have intermingling needs and desires within the work of the Governor's Office and CPRA. So, Chip, we welcome you and thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you, Val. It's a pleasure to be with you here today, and I guess I should start off by saying that I definitely have more headaches than I do talents. I always enjoy speaking at events like this and serving on panels where we discuss coastal restoration and hurricane protection. Because I think these are venues where good ideas are derived from, good discussions are had, good questions are asked. But one of the things that I don't think we do enough within the CPRA and for the state, for that matter, is kind of take a step back and think about where we are as a state and where we are as the CPRA, the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, in our fight to restore our coast and to protect our coastal communities. I'm sure that all of you, I'd like to think that all of you are familiar with how the CPRA was formed after Hurricane Katrina and the major restructuring of state government that took place after the hurricanes. As you know, the first master plan was developed in 2007. The second one came in 2012, and then our third edition of the master plan was unanimously approved in the last legislative session. I think all of us know about Louisiana politics, and any time that you can get a $50 billion plan through the Louisiana legislature with unanimous approval, I think it says a lot about the plan itself, but I think it says a lot about the people behind that plan and what that plan aims to achieve. So that's something that we're very proud of. Every single master plan that is going in front of the state legislature has been unanimously approved. But thinking about the progress that we've made, if you go back to 2007, again, the first master plan, over $20 billion has been secured or implemented for hurricane protection and coastal restoration projects. Over 120 million cubic yards of material have been utilized to create over nearly 40,000 acres of wetlands. Nearly 300 miles of levees have been built or improved since Hurricane Katrina. Think about that, 300 miles. And 60 miles of barrier islands have been built or improved or refurbished since 2007. Those are some great accomplishments. And I think it speaks to the fact that this isn't a plan that we just have on a shelf in Baton Rouge that we hope to one day implement. Good work is happening across coastal Louisiana. And I hope that all of you recognize that. I know that various stakeholder groups across the coast recognize that, but we've got to do a better job of engaging the John Smiths and the Mary Smiths of the world, the general public, to, number one, recognize the risks that they face, and number two, recognize the work that we are doing to address the crisis we face across our coast. So right now, this is really, I think, the time in the coastal program that we had always hoped for. If you look back to prior to Hurricane Katrina, this is a program that was doing about $80 to $120 million worth of work a year. As I mentioned, we've secured over $20 billion, and we've identified over the next 15 to 20 years approximately $10.7 billion. The overwhelming majority of that money must be spent on coastal restoration projects, and that funding comes from a variety of sources. There are two recurring annual sources of revenue, one from state mineral revenue, which is the only source of funding that comes from state government. Historically, that's been anywhere from about $32 million to $35 million a year, but due to the reduction in oil prices, we are anticipating approximately $15 million in FY17. So think about that for a second. $15 million a year, the only source of funding coming from the state government for a $50 billion master plan. Is that enough? We get asked that question a lot when we go to D.C. Well, how much is the state putting up for this plan? And that's a hard question for us to answer. And it's a question that we have discussed with Governor Edwards, and he recognizes it. But as we all know, if you've just witnessed in the special session, the dire situation of the state budget, it's very difficult for us to find additional revenues within the state, considering the fact that our state budget is currently in crisis. So those are the things that we've got to start thinking about. And I think it's kind of the purpose of this panel, really. Where is the additional money going to come from within the state to fund a $50 billion master plan? And before I discuss a few of the ideas, I just want to quickly run through some of the other funding streams that we have. And I know a lot of you, I think I saw Scott here somewhere, was talking about GOMESA. The Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act, that is the only recurring source of revenue that we receive from the federal government. It's a revenue stream that we've largely planned our efforts around. It's a revenue stream that we have anticipated for a long time. If the cap is hit on oil and gas production in those specific areas across our coast, which are eligible for revenue sharing, the maximum amount that the state could receive is $140 million per year. Due to the decline in oil prices, due to the lack of production in the Gulf, that number has been cut in half. So only $68 to $70 million is what we're anticipating to receive this fiscal year from GOMESA revenues. So if you take the reduction in state revenue, the reduction in GOMESA revenues, that's a problem. We've had to scale back our operation based upon those reductions in revenue. Obviously, the BP dollars are starting to come online. You've got the natural resource damage assessment, which is equivalent to about $5 billion, which must be spent on coastal restoration projects and to address specific injuries associated with the BP oil spill. The Restore Act, which is the Clean Water Act fines. I don't know how closely a lot of you follow this funding stream. Very complicated. It's different buckets of funding. Some buckets are split equally amongst the 5 Gulf states. Some are competitive. Bucket 2, which is the only unallocated source of BP dollars to this right now, is about $1.4 billion. And then another portion of that is based upon the impact that the state received during the oil spill. The NIFWIF dollars is about 1.2, which must be spent on sediment diversions in barrier islands across our coast. And then the QIPR program, good old QIPR, right? Back authorized in 1995, it was the only game in town prior to Hurricane Katrina. And if that's reauthorized, I believe the reauthorization is up in 2020, but if it's reauthorized, we could anticipate another $1.1 billion for that program. So if you take a step back, the coastal program for the next 10 to 15 years is on very sound footing. We've got funding that's been that we've hoped for years, which is going to allow some of these larger restoration projects that will have a substantial benefit on our coast to be implemented. But if you think about it, $20 billion compared to a $50 billion master plan, you still got a $30 billion funding gap. Where are you going to get that money? So we've got to do some thinking internally within the state on how we can derive more money within state government. But also, in the last 2 years, we've had to get a little creative on how we can bring private investment into the coastal program. 2 years ago, we developed a program known as the Natural Resource Damage Assessment Restoration Banking Program. And so I'm going to use Val as my kind of guinea pig here, or my example. If Val wants to come to the CPRA, he is a private entity, wants to come to the CPRA, he can open the master plan, he can look at the portfolio of projects that are included in the plan, and he can say, Chip, I want to build, let's just say, Lake Hermitage Marsh Creation Project. He is going to plan it, he's going to permit it, he's going to engineer and design it, he's going to construct it, he's going to maintain that project into perpetuity. What the legislation does on the NERDA banking is that, as we all know, there's a lot of oil and gas production across our coast. There are spills, literally hundreds, maybe thousands of oil spills across our coast on an annual basis. What this program would allow for is if that responsible party has to mitigate due to the damages that he or she caused, or the company caused across our coast, they still have to go through the natural resource damage assessment. They still got to go through all the environmental compliance rules, laws, regulations, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end, once the mitigation requirements have been determined, they could go to Val's company, who built this project, and buy a mitigation credit from Val's entity, from Val's company. So what does that do for us? Val put up the money. The private sector put up the money. There was no money that was put up by the state. We get a project on the ground, and then Val's return is that he can then in turn go sell a mitigation credit to a private responsible party for an oil spill. And so that's one of the things that we're currently promulgating the rules and regulations for that program. This past legislative session, we have implemented a program known as the performance-based contracting. This is simply a separate delivery model for implementing coastal restoration projects. And so what this model would allow for, same concept, private entity can come in, look at the suite of projects included in the state's master plan. They will put up all the money, they will plan it, they will E&D it, they will construct it, they will maintain it into perpetuity. But because of the way that our funding comes in, the BP oil spill dollars specifically, they're over 15 years. And so there's only a certain amount of money each year that we can allocate to those projects. What this delivery mechanism would allow for is for a project to be implemented now, and then we pay that company back over time as the BP oil spill dollars come in. So the state would set the criteria, would set the engineering requirements, the marsh elevation requirements, that the standards that it would need to be built to. Again, Val's firm would maintain that project into perpetuity. But one of the things we've got to look at is what is the value of getting that project on the ground now, paying a percentage that would allow for or create the marketplace for this type of transaction to take place, compared to waiting 10 to 15 years when that project is going to be exponentially more expensive. So those are two examples that I think that we can point to of how the state is thinking creatively about how we can entice private companies to come into the master plan world to get projects on the ground sooner rather than later. So those are two examples. I think that some of the things that Val has talked about, and I don't want to steal anybody's thunder on the panel, as far as if you look in the master plan, these are large-scale type projects. These are projects that are 300, 400, some of the sediment diversions are in excess of $1 billion. There are good projects across the coast that are not included in the master plan. Parish governments will tell you that. Police juries will tell you that. Town councils will tell you that. Those projects are absolutely complementary to and consistent with the state master plan. And we've got to create an environment to where private sector has an interest in investing in those types of projects. And I'm going to give you an example. Earlier this week, we had a gentleman by the name of Ken Wagner, who works for EPA. EPA is the chair of the Gulf Coast Ecosystem Restoration Council, which oversees all of the Clean Water Act funds coming through the Restore Act. Ken is the point guy. He's going to chair that council, so he's going to have more headaches than I do in very short order. But we had the opportunity to have him here in Louisiana on Monday and Tuesday. We took him down to Belle Chase. We took him on a flyover, and as soon as we lifted off, if you've ever taken the flight path down the river, you notice one of the first things that you see is open water is right there. And there's a refinery that sits right there along the Mississippi River. And he was like, oh my God. He was like, the water is right there. And he made the whole analogy of it's like, I'd never really thought of New Orleans as being a coastal city. And he said, but I mean, look at that refinery right there that has economic activity, and like the water's right there. He kept saying it. And he was like, what are they doing? What is the private sector doing to help you in your mission to restore the coast? And it's a question that I didn't want to answer because the answer was nothing. And part of the problem is I don't think the private sector knows that there's these types of smaller projects that they could be investing in that mitigate their risk, that would put maybe some smaller acreage of marsh right in front of that open water that's in front of that refinery right there. And so I think that's a good example of the lack of knowledge, the lack of understanding, number one, that the risk that these companies face. I mean, that's what this is really all about, is protecting our coastal communities, our people, our working coast, and our businesses that support the infrastructure that literally feed and fuel the nation. And so creating a program, whether it's a registry or serving on panels or whatever it may be, to create a marketplace or a program to let private industry know that, number one, that this fight matters, it's important, and that they can have a seat at the table and help us in our fight to do this. So those are just a few things, a few examples, a few programs, a few creative thinking policies and procedures that I think we're thinking through at the state level. But as we always like to say within the CPR, we really are all in this together. And the state can't do this by itself. It's going to take NGOs and nonprofits and stakeholder groups and private sector companies and businesses to help us do this. And so we remain committed to making that happen. So I don't know, am I taking questions now or?
You take a few,
Okay.
and if you want, and then we are going to have the whole panel, and we're going to take questions
Okay.
after, but just a few, just a couple.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Is there a severance tax in Louisiana? In West Virginia, we've had an issue. So we're looking at, well, the teachers are looking at trying to take half of the royalties away from the severance owners because they're just fat cat concentrated wealth around the state. So my question is, number two, is your mineral wealth here owned by out-of-state people or by individual families that you can target? And secondly, how much is the severance tax? Because if you took 50%, the gas companies and the oil companies are really taking a risk and employing people. Oil companies are not without sin. But the royalty owners just seem to be a big, rich, concentrated wealth target.
Sure.
Money walking around.
Sure. So our state mineral revenue, again, the only source of state mineral revenue or the state source of funding that we get is from oil and gas production on state land, state water bottoms. There are certain triggers within that severance tax thing there. So the answer to your question, yes, there is a severance tax. I don't know off the top of my head how much it is, but that there is certain triggers by which when certain levels of production hit, then that severance tax increases based upon those triggers. Again, $35 million a year coming to the state as a result of that. As far as oil and gas production on private lands, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't.
There's some revenue.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely there is. I'll go this way. I'll work my way this way.
Have y'all looked at what some of the other states in the coast are doing? That you're talking about rebuilding the barrier islands and stuff. I work in Mississippi, and one of the things we do over there is we require anyone doing dredging work to first look at using that material that they dredge up, called beneficial use, and using that to rebuild barrier islands when we have projects. When we made that program, really when we made it mandatory, we went from barely having the opportunity to find projects, and now we have way more material than we could possibly use. And we charge them for the opportunity to even do it. But what's happened is that it's significantly cheaper for the private sector to dredge that material out, put it into our
I like the idea. The problem that we face in coastal Louisiana, and I think our coast is a little unique compared to other Gulf states across the Gulf, is it has a lot to do with the quality of the material. So our barrier islands, of course, there's a string of barrier islands that serve as our first line of defense. Based upon the engineering and the studies, the analyses that we've done on those barrier islands to maintain and to build a project that will sustain itself for the maximum amount of years or the shelf life of that project, there is a certain quality of material that you want to put there. And so for a lot of the barrier islands, and specifically the largest restoration project that we've ever done across the coast was the Caminada Headland, which is the beachfront headland right there in front of Port Fourchon. That material was pumped in from over 30 miles from offshore, from ship shoal. And so I like the concept, I like the idea, it seems to make sense, but you don't want to just dredge and dump money on a project and then you're essentially just spinning your wheels because of the lack of quality of sediment. So I think it's something we've got to look at, but I think we've got to make sure that we're putting quality material and quality sediment on these types of projects. But fair point. Yes, ma'am. So that's a good point. So if there's an oil spill, and I think if I understand your question, if there's an oil spill in Cameron Parish, and then Val's company would come in and build a project in St. Bernard Parish, we would not allow that. That would not be an appropriate mitigation requirement for that company. So it would only be, I mean, there would be a vetting between us, Louisiana Oil Spill Coordinator's Office, all of the relevant state agencies to determine, number one, where the mitigation would need to occur, and in the event that there is that type of mitigation bank, we would steer them to that appropriate site. Did that answer your question? Good point.
My question is about the perpetuity. I mean, in Louisiana's coastline, when you're building something, perpetuity is not in that vocabulary.
Yeah.
So if you're going to invest in some kind of banking agreement to build something and sell credits, you're really on the hook.
Yep.
And I know that when I managed a large tract of land, it was something we wouldn't do because, I mean, you've got to have a tremendous bond.
That's correct.
If you're collecting money and selling those credits, and you're on the hook in perpetuity, then a big storm comes along.
That's correct. So I think you may be correcting me in a way that I need to be corrected, because when I mean in perpetuity, it's in perpetuity for the life of the contract. So if the contract span, if we engage in an arrangement that is for a 20-year lifespan or whatever we think the arrangement should be, they are on the hook for that entire lifespan of the contract. So when I say I'm not talking about 200 years from now, that somebody's still on the hook for maintaining that project. It's strictly for that arrangement that we.
That is risky.
Yeah, sure it is.
And my other question was, as you look at this, whether it's a oil and gas facility or any other type of business that's got the water right there, I mean, they have a vested interest in protecting their own industry.
Absolutely.
Particularly
Absolutely.
the oil and gas industry, and you don't see that type of push to have them protect their own industry.
Absolutely.
And to me, that's as far as private investment dollars, that's where the money should go.
Sure. I couldn't agree with you more.
I had just one thought as you were talking is, there's been proposal to reduce the rate of royalties paid to the federal government on OCS leases by this administration. And have y'all begun to factor what those reductions would mean in terms of our take with
Yes.
Go Mesa?
Yes. So the policy that Val is talking about is the Trump administration wants to lower the royalty rate from 18.75, I think, to 12.5%. And the hope or the thought here is that if you lower the royalty rate that's paid to the federal government, that you're going to entice more industry to explore in the outer continental shelf. That scares us because it provides more uncertainty, number one, for the amount of revenue that we're going to get. And based upon the analysis that we did, a quick analysis internally, I'm not sure that the economics match the reason for the policy. Meaning that I think it would result in lower revenue coming to the state. Because I don't think just by lowering that percentage that you're going to entice that many more private sector companies, which will then produce that much more revenue to increase your overall GOMESA share. We just got asked, I don't know if it was by Mark or somebody, but just asked, but look, I mean, the bottom line is we can't afford another gamble for our coast. We've already got a reduction in revenue as GOMESA as it is, and then you throw on this policy which provides more uncertainty, which could in turn or result in even less revenue coming to the state. So not only is that a problem from a financial perspective, it's also a problem for us to adequately plan. When the federal government is saying, yeah, you're going to get $140 million, and you go through a planning effort for the last 5 years taking into account $140 million, and then they say, whoops, sorry, you're only going to get half of that. You're only going to get $68 million, and then you're going to throw in more uncertainty into the market on a policy that we don't even know if it's going to work. That's problematic for us from a financial standpoint and a planning standpoint.
Great. We'll get back to Chip with some more questions, but I appreciate that. Thank you, Chip. We've been in the game for 15 years as a foundation, and the America's Wetland Foundation this past 3 or 4 years has looked at how we can actually go do projects now. And these are not going to be large projects. We'll announce a couple next month, adding to a project we did on the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway there, using innovative scientific techniques like recyclable plastics and hardier grass drains, rosa canes that can withstand saltwater intrusion and greater wave attenuation. But these projects, we think, will pixelate if we can get companies to buy in the $3 to $10 million range, and we can then attract more companies, based on your comment, to do something that's in their best interest, either around the communities where employees come from or where they have their base of operations. As Chip was saying, I flew into New Orleans, and when you look at those plants on the lower Mississippi, the water is really right up to their doorstep. So how do you convince a company, with as complicated as it is, to do these projects on a continuum? $3 or $5 million here, a project maybe up on Lake Maurepas where the land bridge between it and Lake Pontchartrain is eroding, the land along the rim of Lake Salvador, which is right south of New Orleans, and is a huge water bucket basically that pours into New Orleans and Jefferson Parish. That rim is now compromised into the Intercoastal Waterway. The water's coming over from Delta Farms and other places is salinating the freshwater marshes around Lake Salvador. It's growing, and all of these things are around this huge industrial complex. Rick Johnson from Entergy is someone we've worked with, and Entergy we've worked with, I would guess, for over 10 or 12 years with the foundation, maybe even longer. And proactive and creative environmental professional activities are what he works on. He's had many titles with the word environment in it, which only says that the company, I mean, you know, it might seem like nothing, but to have environmental resource managers and people who are environmental specialists, it says that the company is at least looking there. But not Entergy. I mean, Entergy was first to the table with climate change. Entergy sponsored a several million-dollar study when we first worked with them to host the first resiliency hearings in America that we call the Blue Ribbon Resilient Program, leadership forums. And we did it in 13 communities in all the Gulf states, and their study showed how much sea level rise caused by climate change would cost the local governments, and they did the study zip code by zip code. And that data was part of a continuum of projects that Entergy has done, where they have also gone and looked at carbon sequestration, put money into projects, have an environmental fund, that they actually do have a bid process where projects are promoted. Now, this isn't, to me, an ad for Entergy, but I will say that, for me, it is the kind of thing that corporations, and particularly the larger global corporations cited in Louisiana, should look at and have a continuum of environmental activities that they do, and continually update them and follow the process that's been going on. So, Rick, I'll ask you to come up, talk about why a corporation would do this, and where you're going from where you've been. Rick Johnson.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I really appreciate being invited to speak on this important issue. This is actually my third lecture at Tulane this week, so I'm starting to feel like a little bit of an adjunct faculty here.
That's right. You need to get your degree.
That's right. So let me pull up my presentation here.
So this is how you can always tell a corporation from someone else. They're always going to be supported by a good, powerful.
So again, thank you for inviting me. This is an issue that is very close to Entergy's heart because, as you can see on this slide, our service territory is in the coastal zones of Texas and Louisiana, and I'm going to show you a little closer view of that on the next slide. Some of you probably are familiar with our business. I'm sure many of you are customers. Some of you probably know an Entergy employee or two. The thing about a company like ours is that we live and work in the communities that we serve. So we have employees that live, work, and play right alongside of our customers. Many of our employees are customers as well, of course. So we are inextricably tied to the communities we serve. That's something very unique about a utility versus, say, an oil and gas company or other corporate interests and I have to say, I'm going on my 17th year with Entergy. Before that, I've worked in the areas of research and development. I worked for DuPont for a while, environmental consulting. And I have to say, always in an environmental capacity, but I have to say the utility industry is so interesting and fascinating to me because we have so many stakeholders. So many people care about what we do and how we do it. It's truly fascinating and unique, and it's an exciting time actually to be in this field because there are some evolutions occurring in what we're doing. So, but I'm not going to get into that today. I'm here to talk about why we participate in coastal restoration activities, how we do it, and why it's important to us. So, the coastal part of our service territory is at risk. We have acknowledged this risk more than 2 decades ago. We started talking about the physical factors along the coast, coastal region of our territory that are impacting our assets, okay? Yes, our assets are at risk, no question. Power plants, distribution lines, transmission lines, service centers, all of those things are very important to us and are at risk. However, I will point out, too, that it's not just those assets for us. As I mentioned, our customers, the communities we serve, and where our customers live, work, and play are at risk. So long-term sustainability and growth of these areas is critical for a company like ours. We recognize our role in helping these communities grow and enhance their quality of life. So what have we done to evaluate and mitigate this risk? Well, Val mentioned the adaptation study. We now refer to it as kind of adaptation and resilience because it evolved from that concept of investing today in measures that will help prevent damage in the future. We partnered with, of course, America's Wetland Foundation, and we also partnered with an insurance company, the insurance industry, to help us better understand what the long-term risk is to not just Entergy, but the communities, the rest of the economy along the coast here in Louisiana, and actually the entire energy coast. We looked at this all the way from Alabama all the way over to the southern tip of Texas. We evaluated, I don't remember how many counties it was or how many zip code zones, but it was basically, I think, about 50 miles inland from the coast, all of the counties and zip codes that were included in that swath of land. We looked at the asset value in the Gulf. We looked at the asset value of all the economic assets along that part of the U.S. Gulf Coast. And so we started doing this. This adaptation study was important to us because we recognized that these risks were already having an impact on our service territory, on our customers, on our business. We moved past the debate on climate change. Entergy was the first U.S. utility to set a voluntary target. We are starting to see serious decarbonization of our the electric sector nationwide, and we are working hard here at Entergy to decarbonize our generation fleet as well. Let's see. So we basically sponsored this study to evaluate adaptation measures. Again, the cost of those measures versus the damage they can avoid long term. And so, as Val mentioned, we went out and did 12 or 13 community forums, Blue Ribbon Resiliency Forums along the Gulf Coast to basically help educate and empower the communities that we serve on the various aspects of how adaptation and resiliency would fit into their equation in terms of their growth and long-term sustainability as a community. You can see they're kind of a little hard to see there, the 8 aspects, but we provided each of the communities with a diagram such as this, and all of the outcome is shown on this particular consolidated diagram. So that's not all that we're doing. That was a big part of launching our effort to evaluate adaptation issues, evaluate resiliency. But we've also supported some local efforts. Concurrently with the adaptation study, we supported a local scientist, Dr. Sarah Mack, many of you probably know her, of Tierra Resources, which is based right here in New Orleans. She has developed a protocol and a methodology for generating CO2 offset credits when wetlands are restored. So when a wetland is restored, we all know that it sequesters carbon. So we worked with her to establish this protocol and methodology. It's been peer-reviewed and established with the American Carbon Registry so that this protocol can be used by landowners, private landowners, to capture that monetary value associated with carbon sequestration. And in the marketplace, the voluntary marketplace for carbon, there are buyers, such as us, there are buyers for voluntary carbon offsets. So what I wanted to do is, I can't explain it better than the scientists that created it. So we have a short video here that I wanted to just share with you that really, it dives off into the science of it, it dives off into the policy behind it, and it explains why it's important.
The beauty and bounty of Louisiana's coastline is in a fragile state. Natural disasters and other factors have over time diminished these once fertile wetlands. Because of this, the economic and environmental viability of this region is at a hinge point. Community and business leaders and environmental experts alike are focused on correcting the issue.
Louisiana has some of the fastest rates of wetland loss in the world, occurring at a rate of about 1 football field every hour. So we are very quickly losing our coastline, which has really large economic, environmental, and social impacts associated with it. One of the bigger impacts that wetlands do is they help protect against hurricanes and flooding. So especially forested wetlands, they protect the levee systems by slowing down that surge and taking off the waves before the surge hits the levee system. As coastal wetlands protect against flooding, they also protect a large part of our economic industries. And a lot of that is the seafood industry. It's about $2.4 billion, as well as the oil and gas industry. So for example, if Port Fourchon, our big port that protects all the oil and gas infrastructure, if that's lost for just 3 weeks due to hurricane, it's up to $14 billion worth of losses, as well as 65,000 jobs.
With so much on the line, it begs the question, what can be done to not only restore what's been damaged, but also to protect what's left. Effective methods for rebuilding, restoring, and protecting have been identified and even implemented. But how to continue to fund these critical activities? An answer may be through the use of carbon credits, a methodology developed by Tierra Resources and its principal, Dr. Sarah Mack.
Any plant, as it grows through photosynthesis, takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and stores the carbon in the plant. Wetlands are one of the most efficient ecosystems at storing carbon. So 1 carbon credit is the equivalent of 1 ton of carbon dioxide. When we wrote the methodology to transact wetland carbon credits, it allows an industry, for example, a power plant that's releasing greenhouse gases, to invest into a wetland restoration project to offset their greenhouse gas emissions.
Here in Lowland, Louisiana, Dr. Mack paired up with the parish in a flagship project that uses the city's wastewater as a means to restore the area's wetlands. Entergy Corporation then helped demonstrate the carbon credit value of the project.
When we approached numerous government agencies first trying to fund a pilot project in our carbon work, we really didn't get anywhere. So Entergy Corporation has been amazing because they've been our primary sponsor from the very beginning. So really none of this work would have come to fruition had they not sponsored us to develop the methodology. So in this case, with the Luling project, the parish wanted to use the sustainable wastewater treatment process that discharges to the wetlands. For the landowner, there really isn't anything that he can do with his land to make money, number one. It's not considered productive land. And number two, if nothing happened, this land would just die and wash away in probably the next 50 years.
I call it a win-win-win. It wins for the parish because it allows the parish to discharge its treated effluent. It's a win for the landowner because it enhances his properties. And it's a win for the environment because if you continue to improve the wetlands through the growth of the cypress and the tupelo gums and all the fauna there, that we need that to hold the land together.
We know that the next hurricane is going to come. We don't know when, we don't know where it'll hit or how strong it'll be, but we know it's going to come. Wetlands are a really important first line of defense for that storm surge that comes with hurricanes in the Gulf. It was important for Entergy to become involved in this project because it hits a lot of the main points that we look for when we're trying to protect the environment and when we're trying to protect our communities and our customers. We can't do well if our customers don't do well. If our customers are not there to take our power, then we can't do well as a business. And if we're not there to give them power, then they have a hard time doing well as communities. At Entergy, our vision statement is "We Power Life." And what that means to us is that our people do what needs to be done to give electricity and other kinds of power to the people in these communities. Preserving these wetlands is absolutely essential to the ongoing existence of these communities.
To learn more about this and the other ways we power life,
Okay, so I couldn't explain it better than that, right? Straight out of the scientist's mouth. And another thing that this sort of activity has provided our company with is valuable experience in carbon accounting. We annually do a greenhouse gas inventory, including some of the offsets that we are able to generate through various projects. And those projects are numerous. With this, this is not the only project we've worked with. Of course, we've done many things with America's Wetland Foundation. And in addition to the ones shown on this slide, we've worked with the Nature Conservancy, Rainforest Alliance, numerous parties, including AWF. And I think that their registry concept, or the concept of various things that they're working on, is just another kind of tool in the toolbox that private entities can use to help us, kind of get a broader picture of what's going on out there. Like I said, we register everything now in a registry, a private registry, but if there are more out there, that we can learn more about what's going on in the marketplace. And my last point is something that was mentioned by Val as well, and that is our Environmental Initiatives Fund. It's an RFP that's open right now. We have funding to support local environmental improvement projects. I have some information here and can provide it to anybody that's interested. But our Environmental Initiatives Fund, the RFP closes out on March 31st, and we are looking for innovative, creative projects. So with that, we'll take a few questions, I guess.
We're going to hold on the questions
Okay.
so to make sure that Jim gets
Yep.
his time, and then we'll take
Yep,
questions
that's
from
fine.
everybody. Thanks
Thank
a
you.
lot, Rick.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm not going to give Jim Blackburn a long introduction, but I'm going to say since 1973 at Rice University, he's headed up legal environmental work. He's created a number of activities in the Houston area, not the least of which is the Speed Center, which is not the speed we normally talk about, but one of those to abate some of the damage that happens in the Houston area. And you may have read him recently in many articles following the Houston floods, where he's been probably one of the most pronounced spokespeople to talk about the Houston area, what's happening to it, and what some of the low-lying areas might need to do to look for a viable future. Jim is, as I said earlier, someone that's given us a great deal of inspiration. The foundation, in fact, has really changed its focus to smaller, on-the-ground projects after doing 15 years of strong advocacy to talk about this issue. And some of the ideas he'll talk about today, I'll explain a little bit later, are in press releases coming in the next month. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to you to save your time. Jim Blackburn.
Thank you, Val. And let me pull this up. Okay. I want to talk to you about something that we call the Texas Coastal Exchange, that actually we've now changed the name to Soil Value Exchange because it has gone well beyond the Texas coast where it first started. Our work started at the Severe Storm Center at Rice University right after Hurricane Ike. We got funded to research what could be done to help Houston. I won't say that we helped a whole lot with Harvey, but we were right in the middle of understanding what was going on when Harvey hit. So we were well positioned to certainly understand what was going on and perhaps to come out of Harvey with better ideas than we would have been able to come up with otherwise. On this slide, I think the important thing is that marsh that you see there basically recovered perfectly from being inundated by Ike, whereas the human settlement patterns were just destroyed all along the Bolivar Peninsula, and that's water running off that basically same area after Ike. Resilience is defined by that natural system. And so we got to thinking, what we wanted to do was to preserve this strip of land. So we started off very modestly looking to try to save it, basically keep from development everything lower than 20-foot elevation. We think 20 feet is a reasonable, worst case without climate change, a storm surge that we would expect up in the Houston area. We're in a red state. We're not going to zone it. It's not going to get regulated. It isn't happening. And so we've got to develop a red state approach. And so we said, can we develop an economy that would keep these landowners? We have a lot of larger land holdings in here, a lot of which get broken up trying to generate cash flow by selling property which ends up being developed, which is, contributes to our problems on the coast. So we were looking for a red state solution that would generate economy. And we ended up migrating to ecological services and trying to see if we could capture value from ecological services. These are ecological services that we do capture value from, everything from leasing wildlife, leasing lands for hunting, to photography, to raising cattle, to all of the seafood that you're well aware of in this part of the world, to timber. All of those are services the ecological system provide that we do manage to monetize, but there's many more that we don't. The area that I showed you has coastal marshlands, we've got prairies, we've got forests, we've got oyster reefs. All of these generate services that are not valued in our economic system. And so our goal was trying to figure out how to generate dollar value. And we have concepts for all of these, but carbon is marked in red because we think it is the one that is both most immediate and will generate the largest cash flow of any of the alternatives we've looked at. Now, Sarah Mack, that Rick was talking about, we've consulted with her, we've picked her brain, we've had her over. She's wonderful, and I love what she's doing. But a lot of people have run into a brick wall on buying and selling carbon. And one part of our system is to try to address that. Now, this is work from Pakala and Sokolow. It's the best study that was ever written about how to solve the climate change issue. You got three choices. You can avoid hydrocarbons, you can minimize hydrocarbons, or you can mitigate or sequester or store hydrocarbons. Avoid and minimization will cause a lot of reduction, but there are some reductions that are going to be hard to impossible to get to. Only thing you can do is either have carbon capture and storage through technology, or you're going to use nature. Oil companies have trouble understanding using nature. That's just totally contrary to their whole kind of corporate concept of how, frankly, you make money, you exist. That's never been part of their culture. So a lot of money has gone into technology to pump carbon dioxide down into geologic formations, store it, and it is impossible to get that done, at least under current concepts, at scale and at an adequate cost. So forest and soil storage are emerging as really the only long-term viable alternative for carbon neutral operations. So basically we're talking about closing the carbon cycle by returning carbon to the soil and basically storing it again. So all of this is about basically creating an economy that's circular in line with the carbon cycle. Marshes are fabulous storers of carbon. I think that's what Val's been talking about, wanting to do. This is from a Sacramento Delta marsh that was restored. And basically, as you see that soil growing, that's carbon being deposited. This one turned out to be 25 tons of carbon dioxide deposited per acre per year. Outlandishly high numbers. That was the Sacramento Delta. But at $40 a ton, that's $1,000 a year income. So huge potential upside to that. The one that has captured our attention are the prairies that are right next to the marshes that go all the way up into the central United States. That's why we've changed our name now to the Soil Value Exchange rather than Texas Coastal, because that prairie vegetation is also a carbon pump. That root system, some of that root system goes down 15 feet, but it solidly goes down 3 to 6 feet. And it's putting carbon dioxide into carbohydrate form through photosynthesis and then transferring it down into the root system. And then the carbohydrate gets basically dispersed within the microbial community and you enhance your soil. We're also finding out that you can shave the peak off of flooding at a watershed scale, and you can enhance base flow on rivers by basically restoring seeps and springs, which is a huge deal in Texas. I don't know if it's that big of a deal here in Louisiana, but in Texas, that's real important. We're talking about growing potatoes, except it's carbon. Our goal is to make every rancher and farmer in the Texas coast, Louisiana coast, all the way up the Midwest into carbon farmers. And it will be a totally different economy that currently exists. By the way, one of the interesting things, and it's not a tragic thing, that we've learned is that the suicide rate among farmers is higher than really the highest of any society that we have. Certainly higher than returning war veterans. I mean, that's horrible. And part of it is because the economic structure of the farm industry is collapsing. This is a different economic model that has legs. And it has the ability, if we can set up a carbon market, that will work for landowners. Our focus in everything we've been doing has been upon landowners. Current U.S. carbon system really doesn't work in Texas. The regulatory and voluntary framework is virtually, I won't tell you it's impossible to comply with, but it sets up standards that most Texas landowners and most, certainly red state landowners, are not going to adhere to. And there's huge potential carbon sequestration that's going untouched. We are trying to set up a system that is reliable, that is scalable, and that's hassle-free. Those are 3 difficult goals. We think we've got ways to do it. But we also want the landowners to benefit. If the landowner can sell more than one benefit, more than one ecological service, we want them to be able to do that. We want to enable that. The current carbon structure restricts everything to selling carbon. You sell carbon, you can't get benefits from anything else or you're disqualified. That's wrong. That's just bad thinking, and it doesn't help our landowners. I want our landowners to stay productive. I want them stacking pancakes up there. And if they can make money off of water supply and flood abatement and fish and wildlife, and as well as cattle, as well as carbon, great. Whatever they can make money off of, they ought to be able to do it and sell carbon storage as well. Now, if you emit methane from the cattle, you have to net it out. You have to come out neutral. What we're looking at is the potential basically of storing all the way up that orange strip, all the way up in through the Midwest. United States current emissions of carbon dioxide, roughly 7 billion metric tons. We figure we can store maybe as much as 1.5. This is at 50% conversion. You could get as high as 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide. So it's got a scale that can make a difference. It can make a dent in United States carbon emissions. Carbon neutral driving is in your future. Not by driving an electric car, which, by the way, Rick, I'm sorry, is not carbon neutral necessarily. Depends on the source of electricity. But if you sequester a car's emission, the average car uses about 527 gallons of gasoline per year. That's almost a football field for sequestration purposes. So just think about every time you drive your car for a year, you need a football field to sequester. How about carbon neutral oil refining? Well, the emissions from 150,000 barrel refinery is about 4.5 million tons of carbon dioxide per year. That takes about 500, 2,000 acre ranches. If you sequester the customer's emissions as well, then that takes about 3% of Texas for one refinery. I was having lunch with a guy from a major oil company that was over meeting with me at the Rice Faculty Club. And he said he wanted to sequester the carbon footprint for his whole corporation. And he said it'd take about 2/3 of the state of Texas to do it. And then he said, it's doable. Environmentalists are not thinking at the right scale. This is scalable, but it is massive change. Take a large hydrocarbon company, 20% of the grasslands of the United States for sequestration. There's not room for everybody. There's not enough capacity out there. Not if we get serious about sequestration. So how does the system work? Plant a flag and start measuring carbon. You measure carbon by coming in with the Giddings probe right now, using a VCS approved methodology. You take a plug of your soil, you get soil density and carbon content, and then you come up with management. Under our system, we don't tell the managers or the landowners what they have to do. If what they do is unsuccessful, we come back and measure in 2021, and if you're still right there at the same line that you were when you started, you get no money. You have nothing to sell. If your carbon has gone up, then you get to sell whatever your increase is. And it is not based on computer modeling, it's based on measurement. That way we can give the landowners flexibility to basically choose their own processes. What our hope is that they will see the landowners that are using certain management techniques and doing much better, and those will be the people who will actually be successful, and then we'll see everyone emulating that success. Some of the current carbon trading systems don't allow credit if more than 5% of the people in the area are using the same methodology. Again, that's crazy. We want to use the most efficient methodology to get the most sequestration from our standpoint. Our system is to link buyers and sellers together. We're working primarily with landowners. Landowners are the key. That's where the capital is. That's where the capacity is. We're setting up standards. We're setting up an internal carbon bank to store carbon dioxide credits. We are going external for registries, for validation and verification, and for measurement firms. We're setting up protocols for all of these systems. We're setting up a sellers club. We will help finance the landowners to do the carbon testing that's necessary. We're developing methodologies right now to try to understand how many test boreholes we will need for 1,000 acres. It's going to vary based on soil type. It will vary based on topography. It'll vary based upon the current usage. But we're trying to set up a system where we offer support to the landowners that want to learn how to do this. That will be financed by buyers that invest in the creation of this system and essentially invest in the Soil Value Exchange, which currently is a nonprofit corporation. It may be converted to a benefit corp. We're not sure yet. This is a companion. There is a companion project that goes with this that is being developed at Arizona State. McDonald's and several others are investing in essentially life cycle analysis of adaptive multipaddock grazing techniques, which is a way of cattle grazing that seems to really accelerate the amount of carbon going into the soil. They're doing mass balancing. They're doing life cycle analysis to understand across the board all of the impacts of this type of activity. Because, I mean, among other things, from what I've been told, McDonald's is looking for a long-term source of healthier grass-fed beef within the United States. It's going to end up being a game of musical chairs for carbon sequestration capacity as the world moves toward carbon neutral thinking. Carbon neutral thinking is emerging because of the market system. You have action after action by corporations declaring for carbon neutrality. British Columbia is going to be carbon neutral. You have cities now around the world that are beginning to ban internal combustion engines from within their municipal limits. There's just a series of things that are happening. Investors are having more and more, well, companies are having more and more difficulty getting money from investors for long-term hydrocarbon projects that don't have a good carbon understanding and reflection of how they're going to deal with carbon coming in the future. Market systems are responding. Current status, we have 2 investors that are going to help us start this system. We're looking for more, but we are basically getting ready to launch this as soon as our handshake agreements turn into contractual agreements and checks. We're going to learn a whole lot in a very fast amount of time about what's involved in setting this up. Thanks for listening to me. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Again, stay here, Jim, and if you both can come up. I have a local question, Jim, to get this started, and we have about 10 minutes or so here. I'd like to know what you're doing, what you're telling folks in the Houston area or trying to convince folks of in the Houston area. In New Orleans, we have a site in the Industrial Canal that I believe, if I'm right, the City Council has talked about allowing to be developed rather than be wetlands. And how do you tell, how do you convince an audience in a city that has undergone so much because of loss of wetlands that doesn't seem, at least in our view, to be wise? I mean, how do you get into those arguments of keeping land useful for carbon sequestration or for other purposes that the ecosystem serves? Is that a fair question?
It's a fair question. I mean, we don't have the the wetland or the proximity of Houston to wetlands is really limited to that area of Houston that's sort of in the far southeast area that comes down on Galveston Bay there. And most of those wetlands were lost, frankly, a long time ago. So we don't have a lot of that as a current issue. We have a huge issue, though, with the economic future of Houston. Harris County is the largest single carbon-emitting county in the United States. Our economy is based on a set of industries and a set of companies that are basically dependent on being able to issue or to emit carbon dioxide, which is not going to continue into the future. So we're trying to talk about Houston actually investing in carbon sequestration capacity to help the industries along that may be not moving as fast as they should be, because this is going to be a limited commodity. And we feel like, and frankly, I can talk to anybody in Houston about this if I talk money. If I talk regulation, if I talk the wonderful environmental value of things, I can lose a lot of audiences. But it's if I can talk money. There's one thing I can tell you. I had a business mentor of mine put his arm around me one time. He said, "Blackburn, have you ever thought about the buggy?" And I said, "What are you talking about, Jake?" And he said, "You know, the horse and buggies. They're not around anymore." They were gone in less than 10 years with the onset of the automobile. Nothing moves as fast as a market system. When it decides to go somewhere, it's going to go this direction.
Okay, we've got the state, who is responsible for enacting a master plan, creating new innovative policies to bring money, because there's not going to be enough ultimately. And we have an example of a corporation who has an internal policy that's wrapped around some of these ecosystem issues while it drives its business plan forward. And we have an individual who spent his life's work developing a way to have ecosystem services valued and for sale. And so open up for questions. We have about 10 minutes, and you can ask anyone anything, I believe.
Of course, Scott's hand goes up.
Thanks for preemptively answering other questions. But I guess markets are great. I think I agree with you about how education to corporations about the value of assistive services is critical. I think, though, concerned about the example we have had, which is the wetland mitigation for process. There's that first generation of, yeah, we're going to do good, we're going to conserve the wetlands, there's going to be an exchange. There was that round of education. But in Louisiana, at least, it seems like the word mitigation, the word market just became the next regulation. That was the thing that was politically untenable. And so in 2014, I know our representation was just attacking those standards, and the standards were, well, I think there's this agreement about whether they were lowered. We think they were lowered, but they were at least destabilized. And you said uncertainty is the enemy. How do, if we succeed in establishing a carbon market, a water quality trading system, good standards, how do we, over the long term, maintain those standards so we don't see this attack on the standards?
Okay, let's take it. Want to start?
I'll just throw out that from our standpoint, the system being developed, frankly, outside of the governmental system is helpful, and at least I think having the ability to make swift responses and swift changes and try to keep up with changing circumstances that perhaps a government regulatory system has more trouble doing. Not saying it's impossible, but I just think that's one positive.
But Jim, how do you keep it out of the political state legislative realm to make the standards seem either red or blue? I mean,
well, I think the standards are private market, and they really, I mean, I didn't mention government once in my presentation. There's nothing governmental about it. It's all a private system, period.
Yeah, I'll just add, if there's a price signal in the marketplace for whatever you're dealing with, there's that. If you have that kind of predictable price signal on something like, wetlands restoration, CO2 generated, or wetlands restoration generated CO2 credits, then, assuming there are buyers in a voluntary market, You're right, though. With wetlands, it became mandatory, and now there's like a shortage of wetlands mitigation credits. Now they're very scarce, and so. But if there's a price signal for some of these ecosystem services that Jim's talking about, then perhaps that marketplace will drive those investments. I agree. Command and control is not. It gets bogged down.
I come from a regulatory background. I love regulation. I've worked with it my whole career, but there doesn't do some things, and Texas isn't going to go there. So, this is just sort of trying to find a different mousetrap, and this one actually might work, and it has a lot of advantages. There's going to be a lot of contracts to be issued. It changes the focus of environmental law to contracts.
Chip, you want to weigh in, or you want to go to another question?
Another question.
Okay, quick lightning round. Let's go.
I will say I think it's worth looking into. But I mean, as Jim said, I think that this is a massive change in the way people look at this. And I think that anytime we do, even for the NERDA banking initiative that I talked about, the performance-based contracting. Those are things. The legislation on creating the program is the easy part. When you stand up the program is where you really get into the nuts and bolts of making this. You realize how difficult and how massive of a change it really is. But I do think it is a fascinating concept, and I think something that we need to kind of keep peeling back on.
I'm not a scientist, so my questions may be very unknowledgeable, but if you increase the amount of carbon in soil that is used for active farming, does that contribute to pollution in farming runoff, and does it require more fertilizer to keep that soil abundant and producing?
Your question actually is not at all naive. You just really have to change all practices. You're not going to be able to till the land and keep carbon in the ground. So you have to do things to keep the carbon secure. So no-till farming practices offer some real interesting options. Also restoring prairies, restoring ecosystems, and basically maybe grazing them. There are things you can do, but there's other things you can't do. But these measurements simply will show no carbon in the ground if you don't adhere to those practices. But at some point when you make the sale, you have to make some guarantees about keeping it in the ground.
Mark.
So I still don't understand why the oil companies agreed to participate in this. What financial benefit do they get from this now, when there's no regulatory requirement to reduce carbon?
Well, it's not like they're all running and saying, sign us up. But we've got two. And it was two we didn't have 6 months ago. I would tell you the signals within the market are changing. Look at the divestment movements that are out there. Look at, I've been talking with the oil companies. It's harder for them to get capital than it used to be. There's more questions. Pope Francis's encyclical, Laudato Si. There's a moral, kind of stake in the ground about, hydrocarbons and climate change. You've got the whole ExxonMobil, Massachusetts, New York issue that gets to the whole question of what is the kind of responsibility of the board of directors with regard to the information that's submitted to the public versus what is internally known about the effects of climate change. Are those stories the same? All of that is pressure that is creating uncertainty, and nothing that corporations hate more than uncertainty.
Yeah, and I think that we're seeing more chatter under the veneer in the private sector about stranded assets, about corporate board members determining that their investments or institutional investments need to come from a certain percentage of green funds. So I think there is a trend that is happening naturally that we haven't seen before. And to stand up in front of your board, you're going to have some portfolio in sustainability, however you define that.
Yeah, absent regulations, I'll just add, just to enhance what's been said, absent a regulatory environment, a strong regulatory environment, investors and customers will really drive a corporation to maintain its conscience, or to invest in sustainable solutions. So absent that regulatory structure, those other pressures will kind of maintain that that signal to the corporation that it's important to their stakeholders. Regulations and regulators are not our only stakeholder.
And it's a little different in the public utility, too. I mean, we have to acknowledge that.
Yeah,
We have
absolutely.
A different drive, but we're seeing it in the corporate boards driving folks. A large multinational corporation's chairman of the board, big largest investor, is pushing for a reduction in carbon footprint of a major mining company. So that's where you're seeing it from, I think, and we want to be available, and I know Jim does, and the state and others, to have a registry of projects ready to go that these companies can go in and purchase and start paying for while everything else takes care of itself, however that happens. Anything else? I think our folks will be here for a few minutes. Yes?
I've just got a quick one. Jim, how does your plan interface with authorizations for initiatives and all that else?
I do not know the answers to any of those questions. We are working with NRCS. We have essentially the Texas State Office of NRCS that is basically opened their resources to us in terms of they want to see this system work. There's going to be a lot of inconsistencies, I think, with what we're proposing in the long term and where Department of Agriculture is, and how those meet. We're still trying to figure that out.
One more, and then we're going to go.
We have a question about the narrative banking project. A private investor comes in and fully funds the bills, plans the project, and it's a wetland creation. What's the state's opinion of who owns that land it creates?
Boy.
Oh, boy.
So if a private land, let's take it from this way, if a private landowner's land erodes, it becomes state water bottom, correct? If the state restores that land, it is then the land, I always mix this up. It is then the land of it becomes the private landowner's land. Depending on where it is. But so if, on the NERDA banking, I guess it would depend on where it is as well. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, listen, these are very busy folks.
You could just blow the box off this whole discussion with that.
That's a longer discussion than the 5 minutes we're over. But these are busy folks. They've given us time on a Friday afternoon. We appreciate you all so much. Jim, thanks for coming to Texas. And thank you all. Appreciate it.